Of all the figures we have talked about over the course of this podcast, I can't think of one who is more complicated and difficult than Isaac Newton. In fact, I can't really think of anyone I've encountered in all of my reading who is as complicated and difficult as Isaac Newton. As we'll discuss over the next few episodes, the man was a recluse who engaged in tremendously public disputes over priority of intellectual discoveries and the role of God in the cosmos. He was a deeply religious figure who rejected most of the conventional theology of his day. He was a brilliant thinker who created a mathematical clockwork universe, who took inspiration from the idea that it was created and directed by a being specifically for the purpose of his relationship with humanity, and someone whose study of alchemy, a field rapidly moving to the edges of science in his time, may have profoundly influenced his greatest and most enigmatic creation, that of gravity. Isaac Newton is both a study of contrasts and yet also a man whose adherence to certain fundamental principles and ideas formed every intellectual current of his life. In the words of the husband of his half-niece, Newton, quote, abhorred and detested persecution, and mercy to beast and man was the darling topic he loved to dwell upon, end quote. However, in his later life as warden of the mint, he was also responsible for sending men to the gallows for the crimes of counterfeiting and clipping the currency of Britain. To his friends, he was generous and kind, but to those he felt had slighted him, he was invariably cruel and vindictive, often carrying out vengeance for slights real and imagined, even beyond his opponent's death. In all of this, Newton is an extraordinarily difficult and exhausting man to get to know. His brilliance is beyond that of all but a handful of men, and so his work often looks almost magical when first examined, and when later it is unraveled, its insight leaves one just stunned. It's a hard standard to compare oneself to. And yet, over and over, one also has to confront and deal with his pettiness and ugliness in human affairs, something that often seems so very unnecessary. He is not a Kepler who struggles against the circumstances of his time, exposed and burnished his humanity, but rather a man who never seemed to rise above the lesser tendencies of the meanness of the human condition when engaged in intellectual combat. The way I see Newton, I think, is colored by my experience in academia, working with mathematicians and physical scientists in many different roles. While I'm sure that this is also true of other disciplines as well, what I have found is that there is a type of person in these disciplines who sees the world in very stark and crystalline terms. They have determined, through the use of reason, at least in their own minds, the true nature of reality, and have done so in a way that is very deductive, at least to them. And so they can't understand how anyone could arrive at any other conclusion than the one they have. Thus they see themselves as completely right, with little or no possibility for error, and they quickly become impatient with those who have not reached the same conclusions they have. Moreover, the presence of those who have conflicting views, especially if those views can't be quickly refuted, stands as a profoundly uncomfortable challenge to their process, and thus, in the most extreme cases, those individuals must be removed or destroyed. Now, to be sure, most mathematicians and scientists don't fall into this category, and those who may aren't nearly as extreme as the example I just gave. But just as Dirac was, at times, viewed as almost inhuman by his colleagues working in quantum field theory, Newton must have seemed otherworldly to many of those around him. In this episode, we'll take a look at the earliest years of Newton's life, long before he became the celebrated president of the Royal Society, the warden of the mint, a knight of the realm, and a national hero. This week, our journey begins in the quiet English countryside, in a place known as Lincolnshire, on a very humble farm.
Hello, and welcome to the Scientific Odyssey. The Scientific Odyssey is a mini-part journey into the history and philosophy of science. My name is Chad Davies, and I'm the writer, host, and producer of the podcast, where we consider the ideas, processes, and results of over 2,500 years of scientific inquiry and discovery.
Series 3, Finding Our Place. Episode 27.1, Supplemental. Isaac Newton, The Miracle Years. In 1642, the countryside of Woolsthorpe in Lincolnshire was a bucolic farmland with open fields, small woods, streams, and a few springs. It was dotted here and there with buildings made of timber and clay, and a few other buildings constructed from the gray limestone that was quarried from beneath the thin soil from which the local farmers would scratch out a living through field and flock and orchard. Through the land ran an old Roman road, built with technology unsurpassed and only recently rediscovered. Even today, farmers are still unearthing lost coins from that era when the first structures of organized and regimented civilization came to the British Isles. On some of that land, near the River Witham, a man by the name of Isaac Newton made a living, and early in that year he married Hannah Askoff in his 35th year. In the natural course of things, the couple conceived a child, and with the same excitement and trepidation that often accompanies such an event, they prepared for its arrival. This, however, was to be cut short when, not long after signing his will with the ex of an illiterate man, Isaac was felled by illness, leaving his wife a widow and his unborn son fatherless. The boy's mother came from a genteel family of some education. Her brother William had studied at Cambridge and had become a reverend pastor of the local church, the rectory just 2 miles from the farmhouse. That farmhouse stood on just 20 acres of land that was used mainly to pasture sheep and grow apples. It was a 2-story home, with a short front door, wooden floors, and a working kitchen, and 3 months after Isaac's death, his son would be born in a small room at the top of the stairs. He was a weak and sick infant, so tiny that the 2 women who were sent to get help stopped to rest under a tree as they were sure that he wouldn't survive long enough to make the trip worth their effort. But survive he did, and under the law of the land, the house was a manor, and the child, named after his father, was feudal lord of that land. We don't know all that much about young Isaac's earliest years, but when he was 3, his mother remarried. Her second husband was another rector, a wealthy man twice her age by the name of Barnabas Smith. Smith, wanting a wife but not a stepson, decreed in the marriage negotiations that while the mother would come to live with him, the son would be left behind in Woolsthorpe in the care of his maternal grandmother in exchange for some additional land to be added to his estate, the rents on which would provide for his upkeep. This rejection and abandonment would leave young Isaac with significant intimacy issues for the rest of his life. In the year Isaac was born, the long simmering conflict between the British Crown, occupied by the Catholic Charles I, and the Parliament, made up mostly of Protestant landholders and merchants, boiled over into open conflict, and the first civil war in England since the War of the Roses was begun. For the next 4 years, the forces of the Royalists and Parliamentarians, or Cavaliers and Roundheads as they were sometimes known, fought for control of England, with the Royalist base being just 20 miles to the west of Woolsthorpe, something that would involve much of the countryside of Newton's youth in the conflict. In 1646, Charles I was captured, and the first phase of the war was ended. But 2 years later, it would be reignited after a secret deal between the king and forces in Scotland was reached, and for the next 2 years the conflict would continue until, in 1648, the forces of Parliament were once again successful. This bit of treachery by the king, at least as viewed from the side of the victorious, led to the conviction of Charles on the charges of treason, and his beheading soon followed. While we don't have any record of Isaac's feelings or thoughts during this time on these sorts of matters, the beheading of a divinely appointed monarch by those loyal to Oliver Cromwell would have been earth-shaking to all living in the countryside, and who attended the local Anglican churches, of which Charles had once been the head. While the civil wars would continue for a time in Scotland and Ireland, in England the country would be ruled for the next 9 years by the de facto monarch Oliver Cromwell, an adherent to an austere form of the Calvinistic view of Christianity known as Puritanism. Without getting into all of the ins and outs of the theological variances of the Anglican, Presbyterian, and Puritan versions of the Christian faith, not to mention those of the Catholics who remain throughout the realm, the rule of Cromwell brought to the center of British life a strict and somewhat apocalyptic faith that focused on humanity's depravity in the eyes of a harsh and often unforgiving God. To get a sense of this, we need to look no further than what is perhaps the most famous sermon given on American soil, that of Jonathan Edwards' Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. While preached and published nearly a century after Newton's birth, it accurately captures some of the core beliefs of the deeply Calvinistic theology held by Cromwell and his fellow Puritans during the time of his protectorate. To give you a sense, I'd like to read a few quotes from Edwards' sermon. Quote, "The observation from the words that I would now insist upon is this: there is nothing that keeps wicked men at any one moment out of hell but the mere pleasure of God. So that thus it is that natural men are held in the hand of God over the pit of hell. They have deserved the fiery pit, and are already sentenced to it. And God is dreadfully provoked. His anger is great towards them, as to those that are actually suffering in the executions of the fierceness of his wrath in hell. And they have done nothing in the least to appease or abate that anger. Neither is God in the least bound by any promise to hold them up one moment. The devil is waiting for them. Hell is gaping for them. The flames gather and ash about them, and would fain lay hold on them and swallow them up. The fire pent up in their own hearts is struggling to break out, and they have no interest in any mediator. There are no means within reach that can be any security to them. In short, they have no refuge, nothing to take hold of. All that preserves them every moment is the mere arbitrary will and uncovenanted, unobliged forbearance of an incensed God. The God that holds you over the pit of hell, much as one holds a spider or some loathsome insect over the fire, abhors you, and is dreadfully provoked. His wrath towards you burns like fire. He looks upon you as worthy of nothing else but to be cast into the fire. He is of purer eyes than to bear to have you in his sight. You are 10,000 times so abominable in his eyes as the most hateful, venomous serpent is in ours. You have offended him infinitely more than ever a stubborn rebel did his prince, and yet 'tis nothing but his hand that holds you from falling into the fire every moment." End quote. So, with those very cheery words, why does this matter? Why am I talking about the fire and brimstone sermon of a man 200 years in the grave with reference to one of the greatest mathematicians and physicists that ever lived? The reason is that Newton would have grown up from the time of his 6th birthday until his 16th with these sorts of messages forming the core of one of the most dominant voices, if not the most dominant voice, in the theological conversation of his world at the time. As one of Newton's biographers, the psychologist Frank Manuel, points out, Newton's biological father was absent, even as a memory, and his stepfather had rejected him. So it is very likely that Newton, from an early age, began to look to God the Father to fill that role, as his closest male relative, his uncle, was the pastor of the church 2 miles away from the farmhouse he grew up in. This need for a father figure that would not abandon him and was not subject to the vicissitudes of a chaotic and disorderly world would lead him to an understanding of God that was both central to everything he would later do and be very out of step with the broader theological views of his times, a topic we shall return to at a later date. So, besides the religious and political turmoil that would roil his world, what was Newton's childhood like? Well, to first build off what we just discussed, Newton was brought up in a religiously devout household that was financially well off. In addition to the rents derived from the farm property, Newton's mother would have had access to additional wealth through both her family and, after her remarriage, that of Barnabas Smith, though these would obviously be quite restricted. Over the 7 years between 1646 and 1653, Hannah would bear 3 more children before Smith slipped his mortal coil. After his passing, she would return to Woolsthorpe, though her relationship with her oldest son would remain strained. From the age of 6 until 12, Newton attended local schools, after which he moved to the town of his uncle William to attend the Grantham Grammar School. When school was in session, he lodged with one Joseph Clark, the local apothecary, and it was at his shop, filled with all sorts of medicinal plants and chemicals, that Newton seemed to have engaged his truly prodigious curiosity. Newton would bring herbs to Clark's apprentices and learn about their properties and uses, and it was here that his genius became evident to all in the Clark household. It was also during this time that Newton's interest in building machines of various sorts really blossomed as well. As part of this hobby, Newton spent most of the money his mother sent him buying tools for a sort of workshop where he would craft his creations. Things that would range from furniture for the doll houses of Clark's stepdaughters to machines first set forth in a book published by John Bate titled Mysteries of Nature and Art. However, Newton was not satisfied with just reproducing what was described in Bates' book. He had to improve on it as much as possible. One story goes that when he decided to construct a small windmill model, he went to a neighboring village to see a real version of that being constructed. While there, he spoke with the workmen until he gained a complete understanding of the various mechanisms required to transmit the movement of the wind at the blades into the working motion of the mill. Upon the conclusion of the visit, Newton returned to Grantham and built a perfect model of what he had seen. He then improved on this by creating a way to move the sails of the windmill by connecting them to a drive powered by a mouse trying to reach a piece of corn. Think maybe of something a bit like a hamster wheel. While we don't know the specifics of this last piece, apparently people from all around Grantham would travel to town to see Newton's mouse miller. It was also during this time that Newton built his first clocks, including one powered by a small stream of water from a reservoir he filled each day. The box for this timepiece was given to Newton by a man by the name of Humphrey Babington, who had once taught at Trinity College, Cambridge, but had been put out of the faculty there for refusing to take the oath for Cromwell's Commonwealth. Babington would figure prominently later in Newton's life. Once he had mastered mechanical clocks, young Isaac then moved on to making sundials, using various parts of Clark's house as pieces for his apparati. He was also something of a gifted artist and poet, though the latter of these interests would soon prove fleeting. In addition to drawing and etching mathematical figures, he drew various charcoal figures of men, animals, and plants, and in 1659 bought a notebook wherein he worked on the practical aspects of drawing such things as how to make inks and paints of various colors from different types of plants and minerals. All of this should be understood to give lie, as it were, to the oft-told characterization of Newton as one who worked only in his head, a pure theorist, as it were. While it is true that later in life he would become so caught up in his work that he would forget to do things like eat and drink, it can be said that many of his later accomplishments were very much grounded in the practical design and application of real things, skills that he developed at this time. Newton was as much an experimenter as he was a theorist, and it was during this time that he developed many of the skills that would allow him to make discoveries in optics in years to come. Also, during these years in Grantham, there are a couple of other things that can be said. First, Newton wasn't really a great student. It wasn't that he lacked ability, nor was it that the curriculum wasn't sufficiently challenging, something you oftentimes hear today about students who are bored in class. The real issue was that the material just didn't really engage his interest. As we have seen, his attention was focused on things besides learning Greek and Latin and the rudiments of theology. Therefore, he began at the bottom of his class, and one day, on account of his poor performance, he was kicked in the stomach by a classmate on the way to school as sort of a taunt. So humiliating was this that Newton resumed the fight after school in the schoolyard, where he beat the offender until the other boy promised that he would fight no more. In a somewhat later incident, the schoolmaster's son taunted Newton for his poor performance until he lost his temper and smashed the other boy's face into the side of the schoolhouse. Here we have an indication of Newton's temper and inability to handle the criticism leveled against him in a constructive way. After this, though, Newton resolved to never be in a position to be goaded on account of his grades, and so exerted the necessary effort to rise to the top of the class. Whenever he would allow his extracurricular interests to pull him away from his studies, John Stokes, the school's headmaster, would move one of the other boys above him in the rankings, and that would refocus Newton's work. In 1659, however, before he had graduated, Newton's mother pulled him out of the graduate school to bring him home to run the farm. As I explained in the last episode, he was just a complete and absolute disaster at this. He would bribe a servant to take care of managing the affairs of the farm, while he returned to his work of learning everything he could about anything he could. It is during this time that his tendency to lose himself in his studies began to truly manifest himself. So distracted from the everyday affairs of life was he that the servants called him a silly boy who would never be good for anything. Fortunately for Newton, Stokes, the Grantham school headmaster, intervened with his mother and convinced her to let the nearly finished young man complete his studies there. Stokes saw that Newton was immensely talented and had, in his words, an uncommon capacity for learning. He told Newton's mother that her son would be an extraordinary man. The high praise and the offer of free board convinced her to send him back, and in the autumn of 1660, he returned to finish. The other thing to note about Newton from this time was a list that he made of all of the sins that he felt he had committed. And there are two interesting things, at least as far as I look at this list. The first of these is how much this list is like the one made by Kepler when the German man was at university. It points to the common belief that the two men shared across both culture and generation of the important role their relationship with God played in their lives. The second is how minor so many of the offenses are. He scolds himself for reading a frivolous book on Sundays, eating an apple in chapel, doing some small work with his hands, and engaging in idle chatter on the Lord's Day. Other things are typical human struggles and foibles, such as setting his heart on learning and money more than on God, or failing to live according to his beliefs, neglecting to pray, and failing to long for God's laws and instructions. Others are childish pranks and fits of young anger. More serious, and also more indicative of the struggles he will have throughout his life, are the confessions of violence against the sister, the fights with his classmates, and, quote, wishing death and hoping it upon some, end quote, including the memory of threatening to burn down the house of his stepfather and mother when he was a very young child. All of this shows the very serious nature of Newton's faith, so deeply affected by the puritanical emphasis of Cromwell's Commonwealth. Newton's closest relatives may have been Anglican clergy, but that didn't shield him from the harsher view of God shared by many in Great Britain who taught the theology of Calvin and his followers. What is also very clear in these written confessions was Newton's tremendously negative views of his mother and now deceased stepfather, whom he referred to as whore and fornicator, respectively, on multiple occasions. Fortunately, his contact with his mother was about to become more limited for a time. While Stokes may have been the one arguing for Newton to return to Grantham to finish his studies, it was Hannah's brother William and the aforementioned Humphrey Babington who saw the bigger picture and had a longer view. In 1660, Babington had been reinstated to the faculty at Trinity, with the restoration of the Carolingian monarchy in that year. With William working his sister and Babington making the arrangements at Cambridge, it was decided that young Isaac would attend the university with the intention of standing for a degree there. While Hannah wasn't against having her son away from the farm, she wasn't going to pay for any of it, however. In order to make ends meet, Newton would have to enter the university as something known as a sub-Caesar, a sort of servant for either other more wealthy students or the fellows of the college, as the faculty were called. It was like being something a bit like a valet. It is likely that Babington arranged for Newton to serve in that role for him, thus releasing Isaac from the most burdensome responsibilities, at least for the time being. Thus, in 1661, Newton packed his things and made the 100-mile trip south to start his work towards a Bachelor of Arts degree. Arriving in Cambridge in August of 1661, Newton seems to have settled into his life there relatively quickly. The university and its various colleges had received the news of Charles II's restoration to the thrones of England and Scotland very positively, as one might imagine for a traditional enclave of scholars devoted to, in part, preparing ministers for the Anglican Church. Commonwealth supporters who had been appointed to replace those sympathetic to the royal cause were removed from their positions, and the original holders of various offices and professorships were recalled, as in the case in Newton's mentor Babington. In 1662, an influential Anglican scholar named John Preston was made master of Trinity College, and he brought with him a re-emphasis on the more traditional curriculum of study, especially in theology. It should be noted here that while the Stuarts generally, and Charles II specifically, were Catholic, the monarch was also the head of the Church of England. As had been the case with his father, Charles had refused to convert to Protestantism, but he was more willing to allow for a live and let live policy than his stiff-necked father had been. Charles likely recognized that in most things the Church of England was close enough to the Catholic Church in theology and practice, especially compared to the Puritans who had just been removed from power by the New Model Army, that what differences there were could be overlooked while the nation got on with the business of righting itself and moving forward again. Part of this new tolerance was due to the fact that Charles II was, in many ways, very different than the men who had been his predecessors. Modeling himself to a degree after the enlightened despots of the continent, he understood that for England to rise to great power status on the European stage, it had to modernize and embrace science and technology in a more comprehensive way. While the British had always had a knack for the practical aspect of artisan work and technological innovation, its investment in and support of the formal sciences had waned over the years. While Francis Bacon had written deeply and foundationally on what natural philosophy needed to do to emerge from the medieval shackles that bound it, his work had broadly been ignored by those outside of intellectual circles. All of that changed when Charles II came to power. Charles was a supporter of a broad range of intellectual activities as he tried to remake his court in London in the image of that of Louis XIV in Paris. He gave generously to the sciences, encouraged those who sought influence and recognition from the court to do the same. As a result, there were a number of generous contributions of money and resources to the various universities formerly affiliated with the state. To draw maybe a modern parallel, it would be a bit like the U.S. government saying that if a private corporation really wanted to be competitive in bidding for various contracts, it would do well to make generous contributions to the various land-grant institutions that were established in each state it wished to do business in. This practice had actually begun with the City of London in 1597 with the establishment of 7 professorships for Gresham College, and then later at Oxford in 1619 with the civilian professorships. In 1662, however, Charles II allowed for a group of London natural philosophers to found the Royal Society with his blessing, if not his financial support. And in 1663, Henry Lucas donated 4,000 books to the Cambridge Library and enough money to endow a permanent chair in mathematics at the school in his name. The first man selected in this role was the brilliant mathematician Isaac Barrow. For Newton, the first couple of years of collegiate schooling seemed to have been fairly unremarkable. He spent money on the things you'd expect a student to spend money on: ink, pens, paper, clothes, shoes, candles, and the like. As time passed, however, and he got a little more sure of himself, one will also find in his notebooks where he kept a record of his expenditures, a purchase of a chessboard, and then, later, a set of pieces for it. According to his niece, Newton would become an extraordinarily proficient player of the game. He also paid the yearly fee for the use of the college's tennis courts, indicating that, at least at this time, he engaged in regular physical activity. In his record keeping, we also find that Newton had something of a sweet tooth, for there were a number of times and a number of entries for things like cherries and crusted tarts, apples and pears. It's clear that he enjoyed eating well and was willing to spend some money to do it. By 1663, however, Newton was isolated and alone at the college. He hadn't made many friends, and nothing in the curriculum really seemed to engage and hold his interest. It was at this point that he met and fell in with another valet student by the name of John Wickens. The two got along well and thus agreed to room together in order to save money on expenses. This relationship would last for the next 20 years, with Wickens occasionally acting as Newton's scribe and part-time secretary until he took up a position in the Anglican Church in 1683. Wickens' son, Nicholas, would be a source for much of our knowledge of Newton's working habits during his time at Cambridge. During 1663, Newton also became interested in the field of judicial astrology, which was the idea that an individual's future path in society, specifically in the area of whether a person would be a law-abiding citizen or not, could be determined by studying the positions and motions of the planets in the heavens. While initially interested enough in the topic to purchase a book on it, a not insignificant expenditure of his somewhat limited funds, Newton soon grew dissatisfied with the topic and then turned to other subjects. However, it wouldn't be his last foray into astrology. What is important in this, though, is that his study of the subject may have been his entry point into an examination of the geometry of Euclid. What is fascinating here is that in this initial encounter, Newton found Euclid's conclusions to be rather obvious and deemed that the mathematics was trivial, missing the important process of having to prove or demonstrate one's conclusions using deductive reasoning. In the next year, Newton would attend Barrow's first lectures as Lincolnshire, and it was in these that, as they say, the light bulb turned on in Newton's head. It seems that Barrow's rigorous approach in the lectures to proving his conclusions so appealed to Newton that he not only returned to Euclid to master its content, but that he moved on then to studying Descartes' geometry. It is here that I'd like to tell a bit of a story about Newton's approach to learning that work. Newton in his later years would tell his students that his work through the geometry was slow and laborious. He would take up the book and begin at the first page, and work for as long as he could until he got lost in the material. In the first instance, this was before the end of Descartes' first proof. He would then put the book down for a time, and then take it up again and start once more from the beginning until he got lost again, this time a bit further on. Day after day he worked on mastering the material of the book until he understood it cover to cover. What's important to see here is that while Newton was undeniably brilliant, as demonstrated by mastering, as an undergraduate with little formal training in mathematics, the most complex work in the subject at the time, his success was also the result of unfailingly hard work. There is, I think, this common misconception that for people like Newton, their intellectual ability made everything easy. What is clear from this story, and many others like it, is that while his intellect may have opened new vistas for him, it was his dogged determination that allowed him to see them. He may have well stood on the shoulders of giants, but he had to climb hard to get there. For any students listening to these words right now, it's an important lesson to understand. Scientific and mathematical success is easily as much of the result of hard work and persistence as they are the product of some present but ephemeral quality such as intelligence. It was in 1664 that Newton also stood for and received a mathematical scholarship. To do this, he was required to pass an oral examination given by Barrow, who was a bit surprised by Newton's seeming lack of formal training, something that left holes in his knowledge. Barrow, who did not know that Newton had worked through the geometry on his own, was concerned that the young man had gaps in his knowledge of Euclid, and thus nearly denied him the scholarship. Newton, however, was able to demonstrate an understanding of ideas far beyond those of the venerable Greek mathematician, and so Barrow decided to take a chance and awarded him the grant that would allow him the ability to stop being a valet to others at the college and set himself and Wickens up in better accommodations. In his first work as a recipient of the scholarship, probably during the 1664 to 1665 academic year, Newton discovered the generalized binomial theorem. He also stood for and passed the somewhat difficult exam for the Bachelor of Arts. According to some versions of the story, he nearly failed this, though it's more likely that these accounts are conflating this examination with the one given by Barrow for the mathematics scholarship. In any case, he did pass the examination and was admitted to study for the Master of Arts degree. But in the summer of 1665, all of those plans changed, as an old scourge of Europe once again raised its head in England. The plague had returned, and was now always the case. Those in urban areas who could afford to do so scattered to the countryside to avoid being trapped in quarantine. Cambridge was closed, and Newton, along with most of the university's students and faculty, returned home to wait out the disease. For Newton, this absence, notwithstanding a brief return, would turn into nearly 2 miraculous years. As we've already discussed Newton's work in physics and mathematics during these years away from Cambridge, let's focus on a few other things. While some of the work was certainly done on the family farm in Lincolnshire, Newton's strained relationship with his mother likely encouraged him to spend as much time as he could to get away towards the nearby Grantham, probably in the home of Babington, who, for the first year, was also on leave from the university. While Newton likely returned to Cambridge briefly in preparation for the start of the 1666-1667 academic year, a resurgence of the plague in the English countryside sent him home again in rather short order. It was during the first year, as a continuation of the work he did in developing the generalized binomial theorem, that Newton developed his fluxional calculus, as we discussed last time. This work was summarized in an essay read to the faculty and students at Cambridge in October of 1666, and it marked him as one of the world's foremost mathematicians. This work, however, was not formally published at the time, an omission that strikes one as being very odd given its warm reception among the mathematicians at Cambridge and a number of Barrow's correspondents who saw copies of the manuscript. It gives insight into the reclusive nature of Newton, who worked not to gain the adulation of his peers or the notoriety that such success brings, but rather to more completely understand the orderly mind of the Creator. This would be in stark contrast to the approach taken by Newton's soon-to-be rival in the priority dispute regarding who actually discovered calculus in the first place, William Gottfried Leibniz. In physics, it was also during 1665 that Newton's thoughts first turned to the nature of gravitation, and he had his first insights into that. Unlike the calculus, his ideas regarding forces in motion would take another 2 decades to reach fruition due to being both stymied by the more complex nature of the systems being studied and his developing interest in other projects. Nevertheless, it is clear from his notebooks written at this time that many of the ideas that would become the foundation for the Principia would be germinated in this time. In late 1664, as Newton was beginning his master's program, he set out in a new notebook a series of philosophical questions. In this, he thought to put the ideas of Aristotelian philosophy, and I mean that very broadly, to the test. Under the title, quote, Certain Philosophical Questions, end quote, Newton penned the words, Plato is my friend, Aristotle is my friend, but the truth is a greater friend. Under this, Newton began to inscribe a series of questions regarding various topics in the realm of natural philosophy. These included questions about the nature of matter, the nature of heat, the question of why some bodies rose and others fell, and almost every other topic that would end up forming the basis of his research program that he would follow for the rest of his life. In the 2 years that followed, he would add to the notebook various thoughts and conjectures, criticisms of conventional hypotheses, and other commentary regarding the topics. If he thought about something, he tried to write it down so that he could return where he had left off when he came back to it. In each case, he also wrote down proposed experiments to test his conjectures. Among the other topics considered, in addition to these in natural philosophy, was the relationship between the mind and the body, what is now called the mind-body problem. This area of philosophical research dated back to the ancient Greeks and had been considered in a great deal of detail by various Islamic philosophers, and had been most recently resurrected in the philosophical writings of Descartes. These, along with these, were considered things like the location of the soul and the interrelationships between those three things, the mind, the body, and the soul, what their roles were, how they interacted, and that kind of thing. These led to a consideration of the idea of free will and what he called unconscious movement, a combination of what we now know to be the autonomous nervous system and ingrained muscle memory. He wondered how a musician could breathe, remember all the correct fingerings on an instrument, and provide artistic interpretation so effortlessly, with the first two seeming to require no conscious thought. In this, he developed ideas that eschewed Descartes' mechanical philosophy and the Hobbesian taint of atheism that accompanied it. For him, the soul had to have more than just action, but also a principle that called to mind something once the action had ceased. In this, he also wrote about whether animals had souls, and if they did, he wondered what their nature was. What may have been his most revolutionary work, however, during this time, was his investigation of imagination and vision. These investigations often required him to experiment on his own eye, often with real risk of inducing permanent blindness. During these experiments, he would sometimes insert objects between his eyeball and the eye socket, and then use those to apply pressure to the eye, and then he would describe his visual sensations and the like, from which he could draw various conclusions. And yes, by the way, that's absolutely as dangerous as it sounds. Kids, don't try this at home, okay? At other times, he would stare at the sun to see what a bright light would do to any after images he tried to look at, whether his eyes were open or closed. Again, don't try this at home. In the end, this led to a series of experiments on color and light involving prisms. These are the famous experiments where Newton would allow a thin beam of light to enter into a darkened room and then have that beam shine through a prism. A prism is a piece of glass, usually shaped in that time like a triangle, where the light would come in and get bent by the prism through the process we know as refraction. In these experiments, the prism broke the white light of the beam into a rainbow spectrum of colors, the names of which are familiar to any middle school students, known by, of course, the venerable name of Roy G. Biv, or red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. Newton chose to break the continuous spectrum of colors into 7 distinct names based on the notes in a standard octave scale. He was also able to show that differing colors of light could not be broken down any further than that, and that when they were recombined, they did in fact produce white light. As such, he was able to demonstrate that white light was not a color in and of itself, but instead a combination of more basic, undividable colors. This conclusion was in direct contradiction with an earlier idea that colors were created with either combinations of white and black light or the mixing of white light and shadows. The final experiment in this series involved observing a thread, half red and half blue, through a prism, and seeing that this observation displayed the thread broken into 2 segments, one red and the other blue, that were shifted off of each other. This convinced him that light was made up of differing corpuscles that each traveled at a different speed through the glass prism. All of this, of course, led him to reconsider the phenomena of refraction and apply it to a variety of different physical systems, such as thin films and chromatic aberration of spherical lenses. It would be this that would lead him to work on developing the first refracting telescope, that thing that would bring him to the notice of the Society of Gentlemen Investigators, now based in London. They would also bring him into conflict with the man who would serve as his foil and gadfly for much of the rest of his life. One Robert Hooke. The work in light, color, and optics was a brilliant piece of experimental science and would advance knowledge of the subject tremendously. However, like the calculus, it would have to wait some time before it was revealed in its fullness to the rest of the philosophical community. In 1667, when Newton finally returned to Cambridge, he applied for and won a fellowship that made him a minor fellow of Trinity College. The next year, he was awarded the Master of Arts for his work and made a major fellow of the school, something that would trigger a crisis of faith in the now 26-year-old man. With Newton back at Cambridge, I think this is a good place to pause our biographical sketch for the time being. It sets us up well for the next stage of Newton's life, where he steps into the public square for the first time, and then runs square into the buzzsaw that was Robert Hooke. Not finding the experience to his liking, Newton would retreat back to the seclusion of Cambridge for nearly 15 years, where he would take up work on a variety of topics that many would be surprised to learn of later. Between now and then, be sure to stop by our Facebook page to stay in touch with what we're doing and what we're talking about. Just this week, I posted an article written by Tony Christie on his Renaissance Mathematicus blog about a figure we've had to skip over in our narrative, but he was one of the greatest astronomers of this period. If you want to know more, you can search and surf over to that blog or swing by our Facebook page to click on the link there. You can also check out our website, thescientificodyssey.typepad.com, where we can usually post a few additional supporting materials for the things we've discussed in each show. This week, we'll put a few diagrams on Newton's work on color and light for you to take a look at there. Also, be sure to subscribe to the show on whatever service you're using to listen and spread the word about what we're doing here. Also, if you haven't done so already, please give us some thought about leaving a review for us at whatever service you're using to listen. It really helps us get the word out as it moves us up the rankings and more people can see what the show's about. For those who have recently come aboard, welcome to the crew. Especially to those who are following me now on Twitter, it's great to see you there. For those who haven't done so, you can find me at Chad Davies. Finally, as always, we're thankful to the folks at the Blue Dot Sessions for the use of their music. If you're interested in listening to more, check them out at www.sessions.blue. Next week, we'll look at Isaac Newton, conflict and withdrawal. Until then, full sails on your journey.